everybody, it's Monday and that means it's time to look at another Marvel figure, and this week I'm going to be taking a look at the newly released Joe Fixit Marvel Legends figure. Now, this is not the first time we've had Joe Fixit in the Marvel Legends line, and to be fair, it's not even the first time we've had this version of Joe Fixit either, because we did have a Build-A-Figure wave a few years ago where you could build Joe Fixit. Now, this is essentially the same figure, but it has been revamped, retweaked a little bit with the paint taps and some of the accessories, so we have a slightly different version of that self-same figure. And this will come as a little bit of a kick in the teeth, I think, to a lot of fans, because this new version, whilst only tweaked in very minor ways, is clearly superior to that previous release. And if you went to the trouble of tracking down all of those individual figures to build Mr. Fixit first time around, well, you're probably going to feel a little bit shortchanged, as obviously this new version comes in a lot cheaper comparably. But without further ado, let's take a look at this figure, and as ever, we'll start off with the packaging. By now, we're all very familiar with this new plastic-free packaging that Hasbro are offering for the Marvel Legends line, so we can see that it is in this rather small trapezoid kind of shaped package. It's a little bit smaller than some of the bigger packages we've seen lately with those 2-pack figures, but obviously significantly broader and a little bit taller than the standard 6-inch fare that we're used to getting. The overall look and presentation, the design layout is pretty nice. It's a little bare bones, but I do like that they've got these black borders. It contrasts nicely against the purple and the blues in the background. We do have an illustrated image taken from the comic books in the background there. And of course we have this digital rendering of the figure up front and centre. So I think this looks pretty good. It looks displayable. It's nice to see the Incredible Hulk logo listed there as well, which makes it a bit more presentable. I still feel like there's maybe something a little bit more they could do to make this a bit more exciting, but this is perfectly serviceable, and it's not at all bad. If we flip it and look at the side profile, we can see that they do make good use of this space. On one side we have a digital rendering of the figure, so again, depending on your display preference, you can stack this up on your shelf and have all of your action figures on display, or you can flip it and look at the other side and have this artwork of the character instead. Now for me personally, I'd always go for the artwork, but it's entirely up to you, and I do appreciate that Hasbro thought this through and given customers, options here, which is really nice. Then finally, if we flip over the packaging, we have this image again, another digital rendering of the figure, different pose, some of his accessories, alternate head, a little bit of text at the bottom there, a bit of the small print, and then behind him we have this purple sort of collage, which works pretty well. So overall, I think this is pretty attractive and, very functional. So first thing to comment on with this figure is that yes, he is oversized, he's quite chunky and bulky as you would expect, but there's also something a little bit stiff about him as well, which is a little bit disheartening. One of the key selling features of this version of the figure is that it does come with 2 heads, and I particularly like this hatless head. This is really quite nicely done, and this is a brand new sculpt, and I think they've got a really good expression on his face here. It looks mean, sarcastic, angry, all the things you'd associate with Joe Fixit, and I think they've done a good job of capturing a bit more of his personality here. Also like the quiff coming down over his head as well, and I think this looks pretty good. Where it's let down a little bit is around the paint taps. There's really not an awful lot going on here to really draw out the most out of this expression, which is unfortunate, and it would have been nice if there'd been a bit of a wash running through the hair. But other than that, I think this is a really solid head, and I think a lot of fans will be pleased to have this. As I said, there are 2 head sculpts though, so as you can see, there is a version with the hat. I particularly like the white brim around the hat. This is nicely sculpted. Again, he does have a bit of a snarl on his face, which works quite well, and it's perfectly functional. It would have been nice to see a few more paint taps on it, just as with the other head, but all in all, this is perfectly serviceable. Now, at first glance, you might be forgiven for thinking they simply recycled the previous Build-A-Figure version, because that also had a hatted head, but actually, it is a different sculpt, and as you can see here, a very different expression on the face. The rest of the body sculpting though seems to be pretty much identical to what we had last time, which is a shame because I'm not a huge fan of the approach they've taken to this. This separate plastic piece that goes over the centre part of the body, it looks fine, but in terms of operational, it just feels a little bit stiff and a bit awkward, and it perhaps would have been nicer to have actually an open blazer here. That would have been a bit more fun and allowed a bit more flexibility and articulation, I think. What is new though is the colouring they've gone for. So it's moulded in a slightly darker plastic this time around, and the obviously addition of the pinstripe as well. Now this is such a minor thing, but it makes a big difference. This is a lot more presentable, it's a lot more fun, and it's a lot more comic book accurate as well. So I actually really like this rendering a lot more than the original. I think this works much better. That being said, it's a real shame that we're not seeing more paint washes over this figure to really bring out some of the detail and the nuance to it. As it is, it just feels a bit flat and and a bit two-dimensional. Pleasingly, he does come with additional pairs of hands this time. Last time with the Build-A-Figure we just had the closed fist, now we have some open hands. Now, I'm pretty sure we've seen at least one of these before on previous Hulks, although this time obviously coloured grey, and we do have this sort of gripping hand which is ideal for holding his Tommy gun, which we'll take a look at a little bit later. Likewise, if we look at his legs and his shoes, of course we've seen this before, not just on Hulk figures, but some other big builder figures as well, such as Kingpin, for example. Again, not a huge fan of this approach. I think it's serviceable, but at the same time, there's not a lot in the way of paint apps here, so this looks kind of flat and basic, and then when it comes to articulation, it's also quite limited. And speaking of articulation, he has a ball joint in the top of his neck, allowing his head to move from side to side, look up and down, and lean left and right. Although, that being said, I was surprised by how limited this movement actually is. As you can see, there's not a great range of motion here. There are more ball joints in the shoulders, allowing the arms to kick out a fair distance, but not a huge amount. It's a little bit restrictive, which is slightly disappointing. Another disappointment is that there is just a single joint at the elbow. It's a pin swivel, allowing the lower forearm to spin all the way around and hinge to about 90 degrees. It's disappointing because it would have been nice to have had a double joint here. Obviously, this is a bigger, oversized figure, so it's going to be a bit more restrictive. Now, there is a pin swivel at the wrist, allowing the hand to rotate all the way around, and it will hinge forwards and backwards, although you do have to be mindful that when you do that, it is going to want to pop out because that stub is actually quite short. There seems to be a straight swivel at the waist, allowing the figure to move from side to side, but I don't think it's much of a ball joint as he can't really bend forwards or backwards or rock from side to side either. Now, he does have ball joints in the hips, allowing the legs to kick out to the side. There's a complementary thigh swivel at the very top there, which is great. And then we have another pin swivel at the lower leg. So the legs will kick forwards and backwards. Of course, it is a single joint, so that lower leg will hinge to about 90 degrees, but it will also rotate from side to side, similar to the lower forearm up above, but it is a bit more restrictive this time around. And then finally, we do have ball joints in the feet, but I don't like this model because they only kind of rock forwards and backwards and a little bit from side to side. I wouldn't say this is really very poseable. Accessories wise, he doesn't come with anything that's particularly earth shattering, but what we do have is pretty substantial. So we have an alternate head, we have an alternate pair of closed fists, and we have his Tommy gun, which is quite nicely sculpted. Actually comes in two separate parts, so the barrel connects in separately, and this is very nicely sculpted, and you can see some paint apps here, but again, it's lacking a wash, which would have really enhanced the detail. A bit of a black wash over the handle and the grip would have just given it a bit more depth and texture. So whilst there's nothing particularly earth-shattering here, there's nothing particularly new or inventive with these accessories, he does come with a robust set of accessories, everything I would expect him to come with, and there's enough here to create a number of different diverse looks for this figure when you put him on display that keeps him interesting and fun. Now, one thing I did want to point out about the Tommy gun, as much as I love it and the fact that it scales with him beautifully, he is able to hold it with his gripping hand perfectly. You can see his finger goes neatly onto the trigger there, which is absolutely fantastic. But if we zoom out a little bit, you can see that his other remaining hand is this gripping hand, and we even see on the packaging that he can hold this Tommy gun with both hands, except that when I tried to do it, I really couldn't replicate this. The barrel of the gun, the stock of the gun, just digs too much into his lower forearm to allow us to really get a position where I could comfortably get him to hold it. It just wouldn't fit together at all, and that was really disappointing. In the end, this is about as close as I could get it, and as you can see, this is a pretty healthy gap there, so this is not close at all. It still looks pretty cool, so I'm not really griping, but it would have been nice if he could have snugly, easily gripped this gun with both hands. And maybe there's someone out there who can do this and achieve this effect, and perhaps it's just me, but I thought it was worth mentioning because it wasn't easy. Okay, so as a quick visual comparison, here he is standing next to the previous Build-A-Figure version. As you can see, there are a number of different paint apps that are creating a very different look for this character, obviously different head, and he does come with this fantastic Tommy gun. As a quick scale comparison, here he is standing next to a Toy Biz Hulk. This is the Grey Hulk from Toy Biz. This is quite an oversized figure. As you can see, they're roughly neck and neck when it comes to height, so I think this looks pretty good, pretty faithful to what we'd expect. And likewise, here he is standing next to the Thing. Now, I'm not quite sure about the scaling on this because the Thing looks a little bit short, and I feel like the Joe Fixit Hulk should be much more in line with the Thing, and maybe even fractionally smaller. The Thing and the Hulk tend to be roughly approximate the same size, more or less. Obviously, it does depend with the Hulk, but I think with Joe Fixit, certainly they should at least be the same height, if Fixit shouldn't be actually slightly small. So Fixit might actually be a little bit too big here. If we compare him next to it a standard 6-inch Marvel Legends figure. Here he is against the Heroes Return Iron Man. You can see that this looks pretty healthy. I'd still expect him to be taller than your average 6-inch figure, so I think this looks pretty good in terms of scaling, but the more I think about it, the more I think actually this Joe Fixit is probably a little bit too tall. He should maybe be an inch smaller perhaps. And then here he is standing next to Wolverine, so again we can really see a massive height differential here. Again, between Wolverine and Joe Fixit probably shouldn't be as great as this, but obviously there's always going to be a significant height difference between these two characters. Okay, so final thoughts from me. Well, I'm sad to say, but I'm only going to give him 3 stars. Now, this isn't a bad figure. Of course not. It's really, really cool to have a Joe Fixit figure. This is a much-loved character, but we have had one previously, and there's no doubt about it, this is a significant improvement on the original release. I really like the pinstripe. I like that we get alternate hands and alternate head. We get that Tommy gun, and there's no two ways about it. This is superior. In my opinion, this is much better than what we got in that initial Build-A-Figure wave. But that is still a sticking point for me. That's a sore point with this, and although it doesn't really reflect on this figure particularly, it is a bit irritating that we had to go and collect and build a Joe Fixit figure just a few years ago, and they go and release this deluxe version, which is a much more improved version, and yeah, I don't know, that doesn't sit great with me. The other thing is that there's certain issues with this figure that I feel they could have tweaked and improved upon. I'm not a huge fan of that plastic outer coating for his jacket, his blazer, and I wish that they'd done something a little bit different. Maybe it's, as I said, had this open, just to make it look a lot more different to the original release and just to free up the articulation. Articulation is the other issue with this figure, is that it does feel quite limited. We've had some fantastic Hulk figures across the years that have really amazing articulation. You can get them into all sorts of cool poses, and this feels very restrictive. Almost like wearing a suit, I suppose. It does feel like he can't really get into a lot of the poses that I want him to be able to get into. He's definitely a lot more limited in that sense, and we're not able to really even make use of an ab crunch or anything like that to get him into some really fun poses. So it does feel like he can only really stand there and look menacing with his Tommy gun, and that's basically it. You can't really get him into a really cool fighting pose, or it's not easy to, let's put it that way. And that also links into that issue that I had with the Tommy gun, not being able to hold it with both hands, or if you can, then it's obviously going to be a bit of a struggle. It's not something that's going to be easy to do, and that's also a little bit disheartening. That being said, obviously I focused on the negatives there. All in all, this is a really nice version of the character. I do think he looks the part, and this is significantly improved on what went before. So I think ultimately, if you didn't get the first Build-A-Figure first time round, then this is more than going to meet your needs. This is a superior version of the character, so go ahead, pick this up, and I don't think you'll regret it. If you bought the Build-A-Figure previously and you collected and built him, you might be wondering whether it's worth double dipping. I'd probably say yes, because this is superior, and maybe sell your first version, because putting them next to each other, it is like night and day, and this is obviously a vastly improved version of that self-same version of that character. Anyway, I hope that helps, and I hope that makes some sense. If you enjoyed this video, please do give it a like, and remember to subscribe, as there'll be plenty more videos soon.